Okay, so today I'm just gonna try and wrap this up. Some final thoughts on the Heart for Muslims conference. So one of the panels, and I'm not gonna say too much about this because I don't really have that much to expand upon. But it was basically a panel where they asked the question: Are we isolating Christians with Muslim backgrounds? And Saturday was the first time I'd heard this term, Muslim background believers or MBBs, and this is something you. I was flipping through one of Nick Ripken's books, and they had a table in the church which had material from his ministry and different books he had written, devotionals and and literature, and there were also these little wristbands called that said insanity for God, or which basically tried to convey the idea of not limiting your idea of what uh, of um of what it means to serve God, and it emphasizes the cost of discipleship. And this was a book that Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote. It was based on his sermon. He was the head of the Confessing Church in Germany, and one of the main leaders of the spiritual resistance to the Nazi regime and to Adolf Hitler. And he called out the mainline Protestant churches and the church in Germany that had conformed to Nazism in order to survive, rather than openly resist Hitler and the NSDAP. They decided to compromise and cooperate with him, and by doing so, they shamed Christ's message among the German people, and really, well, they shamed the church in Germany. Hi, GW. And his point was that in order to follow Christ, you really have to bear his cross, even if that means sacrificing your life. So this is one of the main themes of Nick Ripken's ministry. Like I said in my previous videos, he and his wife were the first uh, American missionaries of a sort in Somalia before the Somali civil war erupted, right after Mohammed Siad Barre was deposed. They were the first there, and they tried to plant a church, and as a result, many Somalis were saved, but many of them also died because of persecution and the church itself being betrayed. So he he wrote some books explaining what lessons he learned from these missions overseas in the underground church, trying to plant churches and grow disciples in these environments. And he uses the term MBBs a lot, but this was the first time I had actually heard that word, that phrase. And apparently, it's it's something that's used a lot. And there was a bit of a debate about this, whether or not it's whether or not it's a useful or helpful term in welcoming former Muslims into the church. And I don't really have a firm opinion about that. Um, but on the third panel, the third equipping panel, answering difficult questions, this was actually much more. I think this touched on a lot more significant issues. Basically, how to address the elephant or elephants in the room when you're witnessing to Muslims. And the biggest the biggest hurdle is the stark difference in soteriology. This idea that Islam is a fundamentally works-based soteriology where you have to earn your salvation. And someone mentioned this, the host of an apologetics live stream mentioned this, the idea that every Muslim will taste hell, and this is taken directly from the Quran. Muslims are not only not guaranteed eternal security, so to their dying day, they're in limbo about whether or not they'll enter paradise. But they're also guaranteed that they will experience hell, and they're the only to some extent. And the only assurance they have is if they martyr themselves, they'll be able to enter paradise. If they become a shaheed, they'll be. But other short of that, for the vast majority of Muslims, 99% of them, they have no promise that they'll enter heaven. And this is one of the main incentives, particularly in the Palestinian territories around Israel, in the Middle East. This is one of the main incentives for becoming a suicide bomber. The idea that you're guaranteed. You hear a lot about the 72 Houris or the 72 virgins, but I think a much more motivating factor is the idea that you'll be the promise that Islam promises, that you'll be able to enter paradise immediately. This is something that Muslims are perpetually anxious about. So this is something that is a prime motivator for to engage in activities like suicide bombing. And that's another good point. The idea that most Muslims are not that familiar. Like I said, most of them are simply reciting the Quran by rote. They're going to a mosque and um, they're listening to an imam recite the Quran in a foreign language. So if you can't read a text in your own language, you're not going to be able to understand it, even if you memorize it. And this is really important among Muslims. This idea of being a hafiz, memorizing the Quran by rote and being able to recite it, to them, this is an indication of how pious you are and how righteous you are. The idea that you can memorize the Quran even if you don't understand the meaning of it. And they don't understand that that's not really significant. The Quran, first of all, it's not an inspired book. It wasn't divinely created. It's not eternal. All of the Muslim preconceptions about the Quran are false. But even say the Quran was based on actual biblical truth. Say, or to give an example, say you took the Old Testament, part of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch or the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and you memorize that. Even if you were able to memorize that, it wouldn't say anything about your spiritual state or imputed righteousness. It wouldn't say anything about your relationship with God or about whether you actually understand the Bible itself. Someone who can give a good explanation of what the Epistle to Philemon means, and the Epistle to Philemon is one of the shortest books in the entire Bible. It's only about a page long or a page and a half long. But someone who can give a good explanation and convey the truth of that epistle knows more about the Bible than someone who can recite the book of Isaiah by rote just because they studied it for a year and memorized every word, but they have no idea what the significance is, what it means about Israel or the Messiah or the fulfillment of the promises given to Israel, uh, and the prophecy of the coming Messiah. Someone who recites that entire book, um, which I believe is over 60 chapters in length, but doesn't understand any of it, they know less about the Bible than someone who can give you a good explanation or scriptural explanation of what Philemon means and what that means for the church, um, and salvation. So but in Islam, this is something that's emphasized, the idea of being able to recite, being a reciter, and Muhammad himself mentions this in the Quran. This is something that's perceived as being very spiritual, and you have a good understanding of God or Allah if you're able to recite things. And it's really kind of a ridiculous idea, because it doesn't really, it just said, particularly when you think about the emphasis on oral tradition in pre-literate cultures. So when uh, there was no real emphasis on the written word in Arabian society. So you learn things through oral tradition or from memorizing things, and this is and the idea of memorizing texts was extremely important in the ancient world in general, which is why you could have apostles recite large chunks from the Old Testament by memory. You could have them, the speech of Stephen before his martyrdom, where he described the captivity of Israel and their liberation, and basically described the meaning of Jesus and his incarnation. That was something that was typical of really learned, really intelligent Jews who would learn these texts by rote. So the idea of simply being able to memorize a passage or long passages from the Quran, the idea that that's somehow a reflection of your understanding is not accurate. But that's what they believe. Also, the idea of Islam being about obedience and Christ being about transformation. This was something that was brought up during this panel, and it is true. Like I said, as I was saying, it's a very works-based soteriology. You have no eternal security. You have no guarantee that you're going to enter paradise. So you have to continually perform what are perceived within Islam as good deeds. And of course, this is these the goodness of these deeds is arrived at on a completely subjective basis. It's based upon what Muhammad said. So, because he says that eating swine is forbidden, not eating pork is considered something that a holy or righteous Muslim would do. But you can eat camel, even though camel is also prescribed in the Levitical law. So it's a completely subjective morality and a subjective ethics. And speaking of that, that was a this is a good transition into my next point. There, uh, one of the difficult questions that Muslims ask is how sin can be, how Jesus Christ can atone for sin. And they discussed this during the panel. One of the panelists discussed how Islam doesn't have the idea of original sin, the idea of the fall of man, of man's relationship with God being severed by hi, love and light, of man's relationship with God being severed by virtue of the fact that he disobeyed God. Adam and Eve, and then Adam ate from ate from the tree of knowledge, and they disobeyed God's commandment. Therefore, the relationship, the communion between man and God is severed. The relationship they had in the garden is completely cut off, and they're expelled. And henceforth, man has a has an inherited state of sin. He has a sinful nature by virtue of his birth, inheriting it from Adam. And this is a concept that Muslims reject. They don't think that sin needs to be atoned for. They believe that everyone is born innately good. Everyone is born a Muslim. And this is why when someone converts to Islam, they're not called a convert, they're called a revert. So they're reverting to their innate state of goodness. They're simply acknowledging something that was something that existed at the moment of their birth. So they need to be told, and it needs to be explained to them in a cogent way how sin pollutes everything and how that first sin completely severed the relationship between man and God. And one of the panelists used a great analogy for this. She said that it's like, well, you go up to a Muslim and you ask them, if you dropped a small piece of pork inside a bowl of rice, but you removed the pork, would you still be able to eat the rice? And the Muslim's response almost always will be no, you have to discard the bowl, you have to throw the rice out because it's been contaminated, it's been polluted. And this is Muslims, this is a universal opinion among Muslims, among devout Muslims. You can't eat anything that's been contaminated by pork. This is why you have these cases, lawsuits brought by Muslim meat um, Muslim cashiers who refuse to handle pork products and have brought suit over this. They think any sort of even touching pork is haram. It's forbidden. So you should ask them this question: if you dropped a piece of pork in rice, would you be able to eat the rice after you remove the pork? And they'll always answer no. And you have to take that and transition into explaining how that's like sin, how sin pollutes everything. It pollutes even human nature. And there needs to be an atonement, a universally applicable atonement that expiates that sin. You can't simply use some other form of sacrifice in order to atone for that sin. The sacrificial system never really atoned for that sin. It was simply a placeholder and a shadow of the ultimate uh, sacrifice, the atonement for sin in the form of Jesus's sacrifice. And that's something you have to really explain to Muslims, this idea that sin is something that's pervasive and that needs to be atoned for. You can't simply have a sacrifice, or some people believe that prayer is a form of sacrifice, or a prayer that will expiate that sin, that will allow that sin to be forgiven. You need to have it completely cleansed, just like Muslims would throw away a piece of rice that has pork in it. You need that sin nature completely cleansed, and the only way to do that is to get the imputed righteousness of Christ, to have Christ's righteousness. And it says in the Bible, He is our righteousness. To get that, and the only way to do that is to be saved, to believe on Jesus and his sacrifice. So the Muslim point system, it does not work. This idea that you only find out if you're forgiven once you die or after death. The truth is that's too late. By that point, you're at the judgment seat of Christ, and your fate is foreclosed. You know, there is every man is appointed to die, and after death, that's the judgment. The judgment comes after death. So, in other words, you can't negotiate after you're dead. Your fate has already been sealed eternally. And another thing that was brought up, uh, another thing that was brought up was the idea that you can't put on a Christian coat. One of the panelists said you can't put on a Christian coat. In other words, you need a total heart transformation. Muslims, some Muslims might look at this even after discovering that Islam is wrong. They might be tempted to conclude that they need to do things in order to become a Christian, but you really can't do that. It's about a total regeneration of man's heart, and there's no even you could practice, you could try to pretend to be a Christian, but it's not really going to result in any sort of regeneration. It's just going to be you pantomiming things you saw Christians do. And finally, one the idea of bringing bringing God glory, and this kind of ties together the whole difference between a works based and a grace based salvation. The idea of God's grace bringing about your salvation, and you have to think of what form of worship brings more glory, or is Islam really worshiping God? Is Islam really a form of worship? In order to bring what brings God more glory, the idea of you trying to attain, trying to reach up to heaven, trying to build a ladder to heaven, or God bringing the ladder down, just like Jacob's ladder. And there's a really great hymn called I think it's Jacob's Vision, about the idea of salvation and and the ladder, going up the ladder. But the ladder is something that comes from above. It's not you trying to rise up to heaven, because that's impossible. So this is something that would bring God much more glory. He bringing about your salvation, and you not having any role in that. You not trying to work your way into heaven, or trying to perform a series of ablutions and prayers, salat, doing all of these rituals which don't really bring God any glory. It simply magnifies man. And this was something that Muhammad was very interested in, magnifying himself and directing glory on man. It's why he puts so much emphasis on seizing territory and defeating armies. None of these things bring God glory. God isn't impressed when you go around uh, subjugating people and enslaving them and building gigantic victory mosques. All of those mosques, they're not a reflection of God. They're a reflection of man and his own infatuation with himself. So that's another point that should be emphasized. The the Muslim form of worship, if you can call it worship, doesn't bring God any glory. The Christianity, because it acknowledges man's proper role in relationship to God, it gives God all the glory. Um, it gives God the glory that He deserves. And John Piper had a great analogy when he said you want your objective should be to reveal God as he truly is. That should be the goal, your goal as a Christian, to reveal the greatness of God. Kind of like when you're using a telescope and you see various stars, various constellations, um, Sirius or Rigel, or you're basically using a tool in order to reveal the magnitude of that star, and that should be what you're trying to accomplish as a Christian. Simply directing other people, particularly people who aren't believers, directing them to the true glory of God, trying to reveal that. You're not trying to aggrandize God, because there's no possible way you could do that. You could make God seem better than he is. God is perfect. So all you're trying to do is reveal what humanity has concealed, and focus on that. You're not trying trying to pretend that you can make God look greater than he already is. Another point was to know theology, but also know humanity, relating to people in a or relating to their difficulties on a human level, and understanding that a lot of these questions are questions that you might have had before you came to a saving knowledge of God. Uh, Questions about the Trinity and the deity of Christ, and difficult questions that are raised by the Bible. And you have to understand that these people have never been exposed to that. They've never probably read the Gospels. They've never read the Old Testament and all the prophecies uh, of Christ. So they're not really. This is all completely new material. So you should sympathize to some extent with their the roadblocks, and understand that this is a spiritual warfare. These are people that have been blinded, and it's not something that's easily attained or grasped. The knowledge of God and who He is. So you have to sympathize with that to a certain extent. And the there were also a number of workshops. There were two workshops. Blessed the equipping workshop and the learning workshop. The learning workshop were peacemakers, and these people were from ministries that emphasized the peace of Christ and used that as a bridge to the Muslim community. So these were people who were Anabaptists, Mennonites, denominations that are traditionally known for really embodying the message of peace, the peace of Christ, and Jesus is known as the Prince of Peace. If there's something he's known for, in addition to being the truth, he's also known as as the prince or the god of peace, and we find our peace through Christ. And in fact, one of these ministries uh, actually uses from Christ's ministry the uh, the Beatitudes. So Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And these ministries use peace as an olive branch to one of them is called the Crescent Project, and they emphasize that in their evangelism. So one of the things they said, as I said in an earlier video, that they said that Jesus never would have killed a Muslim, and I think this is true, and this is universally applicable. Jesus never would have killed anyone. In his earthly ministry, he wouldn't have approached anything with violence, and you saw that when he rebuked Peter for wanting to defend him with violence, and he actually replaced the ear of Malchus after it was cut off by Peter's sword. And this is something that I think is a good way of approaching any sort of evangelism, because the world as it is today is not it's obviously not in a state of peace, and this is one of the indications that you have that that the devil, or the prince of the power of the air, has a dominant hold over so many people's minds and their lives. There really isn't any sort of peace, and it's not just describing large scale military conflicts. It's describing just basic daily human interactions, which are infused with strife and contention. And even if they don't result in actual physical altercations, there's still a violent aspect to them. And as Jesus said, if you hate someone, you've already violated the commandment, the commandment prohibiting killing or murdering. If you hate someone in your heart, you're essentially killing them, and you're already sinning. So I think this is a really good to and the fact that they came that um these Christians come from a background of of a very peaceful. In fact, some of the greatest martyrs, early Christian martyrs, were Anabaptists who were persecuted. One of them, Dirk Willems, a Dutch Anabaptist who was imprisoned for opposing pedobaptism, or baptizing children, which is a practice that's very common in Roman Catholicism and also mainline Protestant churches. And the Anabaptists were some of the first people, the first Christians to reject this teaching as not biblical. And Dirk Willems was imprisoned and starved. He was starved to the point that he was able to fit through the prison cell doors. He was able to push himself through the bars and use a blanket to escape, to rappel down the prison and run away. And this was in the middle of winter, so he ran across a frozen pond or lake, and was able to survive because he was so thin, so gaunt, that he didn't crack the ice, but his jailer ran after him and fell through the ice. And instead of abandoning him and leaving him to die, he actually rescued him. He took him up from the ice and saved him from freezing to death or drowning. And this is a perfect model for how we should approach these encounters. I'm not saying you should be a pacifist, or pacifism is something that is synonymous with Christianity, but the idea of having compassion for your enemies is something that should really be taken into consideration. And I think that's really a reflection of Christ at his that's really a reflection of Christ's earthly ministry. The idea of being willing to sacrifice your life, and this was a man who was ultimately martyred, and he was burned to death. Being able to sacrifice your life in order to save someone, or have someone, or give someone the opportunity to be saved, someone who's lost, even if it's a risk to your own life or your own health. It's something that's worth doing, because you'll be bearing the cross of Christ. This is something that a lot of the panelists did, going into countries like Somalia or Laos, where their lives were at risk, where they might have been killed. Nick Ripken had a great story about meeting 5 what he thought were Muslims at the airport. At the airport, and following them in a car. The person he met, he thought that he knew who they were, and of course he said he didn't, and he was about to book it right there to just leave. But he stayed there and he followed them, and it turns out they were actually former Muslims who had become believers in Christ. So that ability to risk your own safety and your own security, and to sacrifice that to preach the gospel, is something that's worth considering. So the second workshop was workshop was called "The Difference a Chromosome Can Make," and this was a panel consisting of Nick Ripken's wife. Let me see if I can. Yeah, Ruth Ripken, and 2 Muslim women, one of whom I've mentioned before. She was in the PLO. She was a terrorist who worked for the Saudi, eventually, who moved to America. She eventually moved to Saudi Arabia, worked for the Saudi family, and that's where she found a Christian who was willing to share the gospel with her, and it transformed her life. And another woman, a Shia woman, who came to the U.S., and after being saved, she started to go to mosques, to visit mosques again, in order to build relationships with women, Muslim women, and eventually grew a small community in Michigan, I believe, and in Pennsylvania, and started attracting believers, former Muslims who came to a saving knowledge of Christ. So this was a really interesting panel. There were a number of points they made. One of them being that women influence an entire family, and I talked about this a little bit in my previous video. This idea of being able to win someone to Christ, who's a man, who's the head of the family. He might tell the rest of his family to become Christians, but they'll only be nominal Christians. They won't really be regenerated. And once that man dies, you've lost an entire family. Whereas women can influence an entire family, and they can also turning Muslims to Christ can lessen the persecution the church experiences. Even though one of the main takeaways from this conference was that persecution, in a lot of senses, builds the church, and persecution hardens the resolve. And this is something you saw. This is something you saw in Acts 2 and 4. And Nick Ripken emphasized that a lot in his plenary session. The idea that the Book of Acts is about a church being forged in the crucible of persecution. So, with the persecution actually emboldened the church, and Paul's persecution in the early chapters of Acts forced the apostles to leave, or some of them, to the disciples of Jesus, to leave Jerusalem entirely and to spread. And that's where you saw the fruit come from the Samaritan church, the church in Samaria, and the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch who spread Christianity into Africa. So persecution is expected, and in a sense it does strengthen the resolve of the church, and builds fellowship, and actually attracts and increases and grows the church. But it also can dissipate the church in certain ways. So turning Muslims to Christ can lessen that persecution. And a member of the earlier panel, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, the learning workshop, said, invoked the story of an imam who was a militia leader in Indonesia, and there was a Christian who came over to his house every week for tea and just talked about the gospel and Christ. And he did this for years. And eventually it got to the point where this Islamist militia leader was arguing that was arguing and facing off against the Indonesian government, which persecutes Christians and restricts Christianity, arguing that they should allow this pastor, to increase his church, to build a new church building. Now that's not always something that's feasible, but turning the heart of the enemy and turning him, even if they don't come to a knowledge of Christ, exposing them to the gospel is something that does have a transformative effect on society. So another point that the female panel emphasized was the idea that God created man for woman, and that this was the archetype for the marital relationship: one man and one woman, one husband and one wife. And polygamy, which is integral to Islam, is something that goes against the heart of the Bible, the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis. It's something that is a grave sin. And in fact, one of the first polygamists, or the first polygamist, Lamech, is one of the worst people, one of the worst figures you can find in the Bible. He said that, let me just see if I can read a little bit. Lamech was one of the worst figures of the Bible, because he not only he was not only a polygamist, he's the first person you hear mentioned of who has multiple wives. This was after the fall, after Cain killed his brother, and he justifies it with the fact that with the fact that Cain wasn't struck down by God, and he if Cain was justified according to his reasoning, then he'll be. And here I'll just read a little bit of this. And Lamech said unto his wives Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my voice, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and 70-fold. So he's saying the fact that God protected Cain after killing Abel is justification for him to murder, to willfully kill people. So he was not only a polygamist, the first polygamist, he was also a murderer. And Lamech is a type for the man that Muhammad was. This person who's trying to justify his own unrighteous actions. And this was a man who was a polygamist. So polygamy is something that's completely unscriptural, and it also destroys families. And this was something that V.S. Nepal brought up in his in his book Beyond Belief, when he described the Christian family who actually started following Christ because the matriarch of the family was abandoned by her Muslim husband for another wife. So Islam, even though Islam says that polygamy is righteous and it's important. And in fact, Osama bin Laden was an even bigger fan of polygamy. That he was an even bigger fan of polygamy than he was of jihad, and said it was more important than jihad. So even though Muslims extol polygamy and plural marriage and say that it's great for families, it really isn't. It dissolves families. It breeds resentment. And it's just not the pattern that God set out for marriage. So there were a number of other points that were made during this panel. One of them, and this is a direct quote, "Are we broken for women who have no civil and human rights?" And this was a point that was emphasized, the idea that you can't demand civil rights with no human rights. So women in Islamic societies, it's not that they're second-class citizens or even third-class citizens. They're not considered citizens. They're akin to property. There's no acknowledgement of their humanity. And this is why it's so easy for Muslim men to murder their wives or their daughters. And there are scores of Muslim killings every year, not just in Muslim countries, but in non-Muslim countries, in European countries, in America and Canada. And these are justified under Islam. Muslims will bring up the fact that honor killings per se are not explicitly condoned in the Quran. But the problem is the Quran is not the only source of guidance for Muslims. And Muslims that only rely on the Quran are considered heretics. So in the Hadith, honor killing is explicitly condoned. Plus, you have a Hadith where the Caliph Umar says that the verse of Rahem, or stoning, and in Islam you have lashings. You have lashings for the crime of fornication or nikah. But Umar said that the stoning was in the original Quran, and the truth is we don't have the original Quran. The original, if there was an original Quran, it no longer exists, and it's been destroyed and recopied and edited and transformed and bowdlerized and mutated so many times that we have no idea what the original Quran says. But Umar said the original Quran had the verse of rahem, or stoning. So the original Quran did condone honor killing. But even if you can see the point that the Quran doesn't stipulate honor killing, the Hadith do. And Muslims have to follow the Hadith, at least the Sahih Hadith, um, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Most Muslims will acknowledge that those are still valid and authentic. Yeah, another issue is it leads to many angry men. It completely alters society. And you have the same problem in the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. People like Warren Jeffs and Rulon Jeffs, these cult leaders in Utah who refused to reject plural marriage. The Mormons in Utah eventually changed. They didn't change their teachings. The teaching is still there, but they agreed to reject polygamy as part of a condition for being admitted to the United States as a state. So most 95% of Mormons or 98% of Mormons today will not have more than one wife. But the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints still practice what's in Joseph Smith's writings. They still adhere to that. So if you go to these communities in Utah where they still practice this, you have a social fabric that's completely unraveled. And this is something that you'll find in many Muslim countries. So this idea, but back to the idea of honor killings. Even if it's not explicitly written in today's Quran is not the same Quran as the Quran that existed in the years following Muhammad's death. And it's not so, but even putting that aside, the Hadith do condone honor killings and stipulate that. So you can't say that Islam abhors honor killings. The fact that there are 1,000 honor killings just in Pakistan every year is an indication that it's something that's embedded within the Islamic belief system. But also the idea, like I said, are we broken for women who have no civil rights? There's no civil rights, but there's no human rights. There can't be civil rights. So it's not a case of like second class or third class citizens. It's just women who aren't considered human. They're considered property. And it's why the testimony of one woman or two women is equal to that of one man. So there were some other points made. One of the panelists who was a former Muslim mentioned the fact that it's Muslim single women who are Christians shouldn't witness to single men normally, because it really complicates things, particularly if you're witnessing to a man who still is a Muslim. It's very dangerous. David Wood in the Apostate Prophet talked about this, and they didn't mention it during the panel, but this is something that is really prevalent. Women converting, and you see this with ISIS war brides. You see this a lot in the West, women becoming Muslims after marrying Muslim men. And even after they realize that Islam is a false religion and Muhammad is a false prophet, they're basically stuck there because they've been isolated from their families. Their family doesn't want to have anything to do with them. And they're stuck under the tutelage of a man who denies them their rights and doesn't acknowledge their humanity. So even if they manage to escape that, they still forfeited the right to raise their children. Their children are still going to be raised in a Muslim household, and they've been abandoned by their husband. They might not be employed. So it's a really dangerous situation. Even if at the initial stages they might think that this man is different in some way, that he's not going to exercise rule over her, the very often it changes. And this was something that Carmen bin Laden, a woman who married into the bin Laden family, realized when she met her husband. He was very cosmopolitan and fun, and he kind of seduced her into becoming his wife. But once she became his wife and they returned to Saudi Arabia, he expected her to behave like a typical Saudi woman. So by that point, she was trapped in a country. She didn't have her passport. She wasn't able to leave. She was basically trapped in a country where she was treated like shadow. And that's true. 98% of women in Somalia undergo female genital mutilation, and somewhere between 80%, maybe a little bit higher, in Egypt. And it's practiced in Indonesia. It's a universal Muslim practice within Muslim countries, and it's even practiced in the United States. In fact, there was a female Muslim physician who was prosecuted for conducting genital mutilation, clitoridectomies, and even more brutal, infibulation, where they remove um, not just the hood but the entire. It's really horrifying. Ayaan Hirsi Ali described this in her memoir, Nomad, and she had to undergo that. She's originally from Somalia, and she fled to the Netherlands, and eventually was forced to leave the Netherlands and exiled because of the power and influence of the Muslim minority within that country. So overall, it's just something that you have to consider. Like I said, it was brought up in the David Wood apostate prophet discussion. The idea that men who convert to Islam, 3/4 of them will leave within a year or two, and there might be some consequences, spiritual consequences, but it doesn't ruin their lives. It doesn't isolate them from the community. It doesn't make them pariahs. Whereas if a woman converts, she's bringing an entire family under bondage. So I'm just going to wrap up with what I began with, Nick Ripken and his panel. He was basically the fulcrum of this conference. Like I said, he was involved in the missions board for the Southern Baptist Convention, and he and his wife went to. Yeah, okay, I'll just read a brief biography. Nick and Ruth Ripken are mission veterans of 35 years with the International Mission Board, SBC. They served in Malawi, South Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Germany, Ethiopia, and the Middle East. Today, they serve as global missiologists. The Holy Spirit led the Ripkens on a global pilgrimage to learn from believers in persecution. Meeting over 600 believers in more than 70 countries, the Ripkens sat at their feet. They learned from the suffering church how to thrive, not merely survive, amid great suffering. In circumstances beyond their strength, these brothers and sisters modeled how to trust Christ completely. So he was the focal point of this conference, and he had a final plenary which was entitled "Evangelism and Discipleship Practices in the Context of Persecution," and this was the big lesson to be drawn from. Yeah, in fact, if you search for Heart for Muslims, their Facebook page, I believe they have snippets of the video on their Facebook page, and they also have a website, Heart for Muslims. I don't know if they posted anything there yet, but they have a Facebook page where they periodically posted things, updating it during the conference itself, and they live stream portions of it. So those are probably still there. But he was the focal point of this conference, and he explained not just how to church plant in these circumstances, or how to grow disciples, or what we can learn from the church in terms of in terms of coping with persecution and overcoming persecution. He also talked about how we can learn more. Uh, well, basically, he described what he learned about pastoring from these people, and he said this is really about the essence of who you are and who Jesus is. It's not about mechanics. And he related an anecdote about a group of believers in a Muslim nation, and he asked them what's he basically inquired as to what they thought was the best way, or what was a practical way to do this, to go, um what how is Christ, what what what's what makes Christ appealing to people. And they pointed him to a particular person who was a leader in that church, and he asked them, well, why do you love this guy so much? And he said, I was getting kind of resentful because no one ever loved me. None of my disciples, or the people that the brethren in the church, loved me the way they expressed their love for this guy. And what makes him so special? And they said, well, he borrows money for us. When his father died, he had to take a trip to the U.S., so he borrows money from us. And he asks us for food, and he asks us basically, and he said to himself, I could do all those things. I can do, like, what's so special about that? And he basically, he was basically uh, saying, in not in so many words, but they were saying they loved him because he needed them. In other words, this idea that you swoop in and try, and this was this is an aside, but he told missionaries that they need to make a commitment. They can't tell, and this is how you grow believers, um how you grow disciples in the church. You stay there, you stay rooted. You can't just go there 1 or 2 weeks and say, I'll be with you, I'll see you next time, because unless you won't see them again, and they'll lose faith, not just in you, but in God. But that point, the idea of him needing them, and he said this is something that the church needs to digest, this idea of coming in and say and just providing for the needs of everyone, or not being dependent on on your disciples. This is something that really isn't biblical. You need to be, at points, you need to depend on them, just like uh Paul relied on Timothy. And you look at Paul's letters to Timothy, and you can see how much he relied on him, not just for practical things, bringing his cloak from Troas, or 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 sending people into the mission field, or implementing certain directives within the church. But he relied on him. More importantly, he relied on his fellowship and his love, and he looked at him as a son, as a begotten son. So he was dependent on that, and this is something this is a lesson that the church needs to learn, particularly pastors. And that was a good anecdote in conveying that truth. The idea that this person was loved not because he provided for people's needs, or he was self-sufficient, or he taught these people wonderful doctrine, but he was loved because he was willing to be dependent on his brethren, and they loved that. They loved the necessity of that, and it was something that really endeared him to them. So there were a couple of other points he made in this last plenary. The idea of how truth travels in a culture. You shouldn't, and this was a good quote. He said, "We the church today would make the Samaritan woman go to church to be saved." And this is something, as a missionary for decades, is second nature to him, but something that the church really needs to absorb, that you need to go out and spread the gospel. You can't expect people to come into church in order to be. That's not really the primary function of the local church. It's not attracting people to the services on Sunday morning. You need the you need to go and spread the truth to these people where they are, wherever that is. And the example of the Samaritan woman, she was going about her business, just drawing water, and that's where Jesus met her. And that interaction resulted in an entire community being saved and desiring God. Another point was that he said your team should look like a biological family. The idea that the people who are planting the church, they should be like a family. So just as in a family, you have fathers, you have patriarchs, you have mothers, you also have children and adolescents, and teenagers, and so you also have single men and women who have their own gifts and are working in concert to bring about a revival. So if you have a church family, it should really look like your biological family when you're thinking about missions. Another point he made was the fact that Judas is a reality, that he shows up when there's something worth betraying. So in other words, these churches, and a lot of these churches in the underground church, are experiencing really profound revivals. In China, particularly the house churches, this is something that is very is growing like wildfire, and even in faith, not in spite of, but because of the persecution, it's actually increasing and expanding. And this was something they didn't mention, but something that I thought about was the idea of being more than overcomers. That's something that that's a concept that's hard to grasp. Like, how do you become more than an overcomer? And John Piper had a good explanation of this, what that means. Practically speaking, it's not simply achieving the victory or overcoming in face of adversity and tribulation and trials. It's using that persecution or that distress and turning it around and using it to reap a harvest, and using it to point to God, and harnessing that to to give God glory. So when Paul was imprisoned, when he was imprisoned in Rome, he wrote about how this was emboldening the church. This was actually encouraging people to go out and preach Christ, even if they did it for the wrong motives. He was still still satisfied that Christ was being glorified. So not only did the Roman government, Nero, and the Roman governors and administrators, not only did they not succeed in stamping out Christianity or crushing Christianity, Paul used their persecution and turned it into he kind of exercised a bit of jujitsu and used that to increase the church and build the church and glorify God. So he basically used the people who were tormenting him. He turned them into not not so many words, but he basically turned them into missionaries. He turned them into people who magnified the gospel in a strange way. That's what happened. That's what being more than an overcomer means. It means not simply being victorious, but using your enemies as a way to glorify Christ. And Nick Ripken said the goal is a Pentecost, and I don't think he meant this in a charismatic way. I think he meant the goal is to have the church be what it was at Pentecost, where the disciples and the followers of Jesus simply obeyed him and did as they directed him to as he directed them to do, simply followed his instructions and let the Holy Spirit come upon them. And Nick Ripken was saying that this is what aspirationally this is what the church should aim for. So Judas is a reality. He only shows up when there's something worth betraying. That point, which before I got on a tangent, I was explaining that's something that is really important. Judas is only there because the church is growing, and it's growing in places like China, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where it's facing persecution. And naturally, where there's growth, there will be false teachers and betrayers. But Nick Ripken's point was the Judas, he's not a denier, he's a betrayer. He's someone who's not in outright opposition. He's someone that betrays the church. And you shouldn't import Judases. You should grow them. So the idea is, the basic concept is that in places like North Korea, you're not you have the government trying to incriminate believers, trying to crush the church from, and this is common in places where you have totalitarian governments that won't accept anyone being glorified besides the dear leader or the general secretary or the head of the totalitarian government. But the idea is, these are places where, of course, they're trying to insert people, trying to corrupt it, but you shouldn't grow them. You shouldn't import them. You shouldn't go and seek out Judases. And this ties into another idea that Nick Ripken had mentioned, how hard it is to build a church where you can't trust anyone. There are authoritarian societies where the state exercises supreme control, but only as it touches on politics or the public realm. But you can basically have your own internal life. They will leave your family alone or how you raise your family as long as you don't oppose the state or don't enter into public life. So, and there are countries like that that have that approach to Christianity. They'll allow you to worship privately, but they won't allow anything to go on. But there are other countries where other societies where you can't trust even your own family. The the indoctrination has been impressed upon you for decades and decades from birth, and this is kind of like what North Korea is like. It deforms and changes your relationship to everyone, and it's difficult for the church to adjust to a setting like that, where if you become a believer, then your mother or brother will turn you in. But it's a good reference point because this is what happens a lot of times in Muslim societies. This is why there are honor killings. Just recently, there was someone convicted for killing their children, a Muslim man for killing his children who had become followers of Christ, who had become Christians. So this is something that, even though it looks like an anomaly, if you live in a Western nation where people are allowed to think, to express their thoughts, at the very least within the home or within private life, this is something that is common in the Islamic world and within Islamic households because Muhammad has basically replicated or he served as the type for all of these dystopian totalitarian futures where you can't even think freely because your brain has been so marinated in propaganda, in this false religion, that you can't even communicate with your own family, your own blood. So, I mean, that's just one of the points. There were a lot of others. I know this has been a long video. Um, it's been close to, I think, 3 hours combined, just discussing this one conference. But it was an important event. This is the planner, the program for the event, Heart for Muslims, and the website is heartformuslims.com. But they also have a Facebook page where I think they uploaded videos to the Facebook page. So I would check that out. But this is the last video I'm going to do about that conference, just because I thought it was significant. Some of the things, like I said, it was a really fascinating experience. I learned a lot, not just about church, not just about evangelism or missions or the underground church. I learned a lot of things about what these environments, what these relationships, how they affect people personally. And it was an interesting time. But I'll get back to the Quran read through in my next video. Thanks everyone for showing up. Danka, Love and Light. Thanks Irene, GW, Tamara, AI, everyone else that was watching. Like I said, feel free to share this with friends or enemies, whichever you like. And I'll see you next time.